All right, hey guys, welcome back. So just to quickly highlight Virginia, which was our previous discussion. Remember, people were drawn to Virginia and the southern colonies primarily due to economic ambition. Indentured white males, those who came over to work as sort of slaves with the idea that they would someday be able to own their own property and receive some money, um, came over, and obviously they tended to be single, were involved in drinking and gambling, and so that gave rise to the blue laws that were created in about 1619. It was a more heterogeneous society in Virginia. There are more single men than married couples, and that dominated Virginia in the South. Right? And then we also talked about the influence of English laws and then the Virginia slave codes. In terms of punishment in Virginia, we briefly discussed the whole idea of Dale's laws, which are very similar to Draco's code of ancient Athens in terms of punishment, and obviously the influence on church, in other words, making church attendance mandatory. So now we're going to spend some time and we're going to talk about Massachusetts and the New England colonies. Now, the idea of religious idealism is what brought the Puritans and Pilgrims to America under the Mayflower Compact, which had authority over 102 people. Plymouth, Massachusetts colonies established their own laws related to the needs of their colonies. So again, we have these colonies that were acting independently of each other. There was no consolidated effort at that time in terms of establishing general laws or some level of criminal justice system. As we mentioned earlier, the Puritans migrated with the highest percentage of family units, so the family unit was very important. Village life in Massachusetts was dominated by the family, homogeneous characteristics, a very homogeneous society. In terms of lawgivers, initially there was no separate judicial arm of government, but later developed assistance courts and general courts as a means to deal with different levels of criminal misconducts. So, for example, general courts heard appeals from the assistance courts, and they were the highest court of appeals. So we began to see a level of appeal or courts that would end up having specific type of jurisdiction during this time frame with its development in the Massachusetts and New England colonies. And obviously there was considerable influence of the Bible on criminal justice system in the Massachusetts and New England colonies. Now, in terms of crime and punishment, the main goal of Puritan punishment was to have a church member repent and return to the congregation. It was sort of an idea of a gentle correction. And that is quite different than what we discussed earlier about the Virginia colonies. The Puritans established sumptuary laws, which are basically laws that regulate how you dress, fashion police. So people had to wear a certain type of garments. You wouldn't be allowed to expose certain parts of your body. That was the basis behind sumptuary laws. In some place you call them the fashion police. Church attendance was mandatory, and you had to take the literal acceptance of the Bible as a means to guide your life. Obviously, Massachusetts colonies, because of their religious idealism, multiple offenses of masturbation was punishable by death. Adultery, fornication were particularly targeted by law as well, and primarily because the belief was that these went against the family. And the family was the critical unit that was part of this particular colony. And so again, Massachusetts Puritans high idea of religious idealism, and the whole idea of the family unit was critical and important. Now, when we look at Pennsylvania, now Pennsylvania was settled by the Quakers and based on religious idealism as well. They established religious and civil liberties, that was important, and focused on women's rights and anti-slavery movement, and they were opposed to war as a means to resolve conflict. So, similar in some respects to the Puritans, but in some respects the Quakers were a little bit different. In terms of the lawgivers, the Great Law or body of laws was basically the first criminal code. It also helped create the idea of trial by jury. Also, under Quaker law, non-Christians could not hold office. And as a whole, Quakers were more humane in administering punishment than some of the other colonies that we have talked about. In Pennsylvania, for example, death penalty was reserved for murder and treason, but it was not often used. Punishment for deviant behavior favored the forfeiture of property, also the use of fines and shaming, and to some extent imprisonment. So again, shaming was a very powerful tool in a society that's very homogenous, because it does have a significant impact, whereas societies that are more heterogeneous, that type of punishment does not work as effective as others. The Quakers also gave us the birth of the penitentiary, and the penitentiary was an American creation. And obviously the word penitentiary comes from the word penance. So basically the idea behind a penitentiary was to isolate an individual from those things that society believed caused them to go astray. So oftentimes early penitentiaries were, you were by yourself, you were isolated from others, you had time to repent, and you had time to read the Bible. And so the history of the penitentiary does in fact have some religious history attached to it. So in terms of crime and punishment, in Pennsylvania, crime was more evenly dispersed than the other two colonies. In New England, more property crimes occurred than personal crimes. In Virginia, personal crimes were more frequent than property crimes. Capital crimes were less frequent in Pennsylvania. And then we go back to the concept of prison, which can be traced back to William Penn's Code. And you can read about that on page 63 of your textbook. So the crime trends in Pennsylvania, again, were a little bit different than some of the others. What we began to experience in terms of the Quakers, and the same with the Puritans as well, but as the religious group became less influential. In other words, as the colonies began to receive more residents that were not of that particular faith, the Quakers as a whole became less influential, and so the number of capital crimes began to increase. And so as society becomes more heterogeneous, the influence of one particular group becomes less, and so the laws begin to change a little bit over time. And then we already talked about the fact that prison reform can be traced back to William Penn. So the colonies, in terms of colonial law enforcement, it tended initially to be characterized as unskilled and amateurish. In other words, people who couldn't do anything else became cops. There was little pay, if any. But in the colonial law enforcement, it did give rise to the constable and the sheriff. And both of these concepts came from England. The Shire Reef, as you read about how it developed in England, carried over as the sheriff in the new colonies. And constables were tasked with an array of legal duties as well as keeping the peace. In Virginia, because more sparsely populated than the other colonies, the role of the sheriff was more important. At the time, the sheriff had to reside in the county and he had to own property. The role of undersheriff, deputies, and jailers, and the beginning of the Southern Slave Patrol were established. And the slave patrols that we'll read about more were the beginning, actually, of American policing because of their job, how they were paid. They were designed to enforce specific statutes of the law. And so, although we may not find it logical, but it was in essence sort of the beginning of American policing. And so it's critical to understand that role in terms of the development of law enforcement in this country. And you can trace it back to the roots in the South and the relationship between law enforcement and minority communities to the 50s and into the 60s and then to some extent even into the 70s. So just something to keep in mind as you begin to read through the rest of this chapter. Massachusetts, small town New England, local church elders and settlement laws filled the void of law enforcement. Village constables were involved in enforcing Sabbath laws. Constables used hue and cry as a means to get others to help. Law enforcement beginning to take shape in towns were policed by the constables and the night watchmen, which, although was a formidable idea, often led to allegations of sleeping and drinking on the job. So again, if you had to characterize it, one could argue that early colonial law enforcement was unskilled and amateurish, but it did give us and develop the constable and the sheriff. Pennsylvania, the unique characteristic about Pennsylvania was the election of the sheriff. It was put to a vote, and then Pennsylvania at the time, the two popular vote getters' names were submitted to the governor, and then he was able to select the candidate. There were term limits at the time for sheriffs. You could do no more than 3 one-year stints. So again, the sheriff as an elected official, its history is based here in this country. And for those of you who work for a sheriff department, and if you're an active voter, you understand that sheriffs are elected every 4 years. And so here is some basis for that route. I'm just going to quickly talk about, you can see here, I mentioned slave patrols, but also talk about the impact in terms of large urban areas such as New York City and Boston had considerable influence in terms of trying to provide a night watch system or some level of constables to enforce the laws in those type of environments. A key term that's often associated with our criminal justice system, which is unique, is that of the district attorney. And so you can read about the role of the district attorney. In terms of capital punishment, and I'm going to be running out of time here shortly, but understand that in terms of capital punishment, it was most often used in the South against African American slaves and indentured servants, which were in essence the white slaves. In Virginia, executions were common. There were hundreds of crimes that demanded the death penalty. In Massachusetts, New England didn't really use capital punishment. Capital offenses in Massachusetts were rarely carried out and were in fact not very common. All right, I'll leave this this PowerPoint lecture in its natural form so you can take a look at it as well. I have a couple more things towards the end, but again, as you consider the impact on the early American criminal justice system, go back and review the context of religion, slavery, and demographics, and what are some of the key terms associated with that. All right, I'll talk to you later. Thanks and have a good week. Bye.